And my name is Alyssa Robinson. I am the digital strategist here at Treach, and I am here with our senior pastor, Reverend Daniel Humbert. And Go Beyond is simply a time that we come together each week to dig deeper into the message from Sunday. So Daniel brought us the message this Sunday. We are in a worship series called Faith Works, where we are traveling through the book of James together. And this week we were in chapter 2, where it specifically starts to talk about faith versus works and which is more important. And we come to the conclusion they're equally important. But spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't read it yet. But I did want to ask the question because, Daniel, you brought up in your message on Sunday that there is a bit of a conflict, though some people don't see it as a conflict, between Paul's message and James' message. So Paul's message is all about grace, all you have to do is believe. But James is like, no, you got to step up and do some stuff. And so what I want to know is, why are these messages contradictory, seemingly right next to each other? And how far apart were they? What's the history behind the distance between Paul and James, who they were talking to? How well did they know each other? Were they in conflict with each other? I just want a little bit more about that whole situation.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, they literally were, of course, contemporaries, Paul and James. They were at the Jerusalem Council, talked about in Acts chapter 5, and they knew of each other clearly, and I believe respected each other very admirably. They were writing to different communities of faith. Of course, Paul is writing to specific churches like Corinth or the church at Rome or the church at Ephesus or the churches in Galatia. They're writing, and James is writing primarily into Israel or to Palestine. And they're writing at around the same time, generally speaking. I mean, within about a decade of each other, depending on when Paul's letters, which letters we're talking about. So they're writing at generally the same time, roughly in the 50s, perhaps as late as the early 60s for Paul in particular. As we mentioned last week, I think James probably died in 52 or 59, and so he's obviously writing prior to that. So he may be a little earlier than Paul. But I think they're really talking about two different things when we talk about this seeming conflict about, is it either faith or works? I think Paul is talking about how is it we receive salvation? And the way we receive salvation is by grace through faith. And that's his clear marker in Ephesians and in Romans and even 1 Corinthians, where he just says, look, this is how we gain faith. This is how we, and so my language about that is, this is how we get on the playing field. We get on the playing field by grace through faith. That's how we get there. But once we're on the playing field, I think that's where James takes it, what I would call the next step. He says, so once we have received faith, James is saying, hey, let's do something with that. It's not, in other words, it's not an intellectual or even simply an emotional affair. It is, it takes action. It takes doing something. And that's where I say Paul and James actually agree on a couple of things. As I mentioned in the message, in Galatians and in Ephesians and in Philippians, Paul has several points at which he talks about, hey man, this you got to take this sort of one step further. In Galatians, he talks about it as the kind of faith that works through love, or in Philippians, he talks about keep on working out your salvation. In other words, it's a journey. It's not just something you achieve at one point and you're done. And then in Ephesians, literally just 2 verses after the very famous chapter 2, verse 8, where Paul says, hey, we are saved by grace through faith. It's not your own doing. It's a gift of God. Then in verse 10, he literally says, in Christ, God created us for good works. I mean, he literally says that. So I think Paul really agrees with James. It's just that they were talking at 2 different levels. Paul on the front end, if you will, about how we gain faith. And then James sort of, once we have faith, that faith must have works. And that, of course, is what Jesus talked about, right? I mean, Jesus was very clear in Matthew's gospel in particular that we will be judged come judgment day at the end of our journey, if you will, on what we did with our faith, not how we claimed our faith. So,
Well, and now that you bring up judgment, that's one of the questions that I had too, because in James 2, verses 12 through 13, it says, so speak and so act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty, for judgment will be without mercy to anyone who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. And so I know that's a rough one, because I think that so often, um, man, the idea of judgment and Christianity melded together leaves such a bad taste in people's mouths, because so many people have been judged by Christians, and we have had hammered into our head, judge lest not be judged. And so I want to know, what does that mean in this context, to live as though you're being judged? Because for me, the way that I was raised, and I probably was raised more liberally and progressive than a lot of other people, but I was raised to live without shame and to understand that I am loved no matter what, and I am shrouded in grace. But then this verse is telling me, live as though you're being judged. And that doesn't feel good. So, like,
yeah, yeah.
what am I supposed to take from that?
Well, so I render that as James is rendering what Jesus told us we would be judged by, and it's God's judgment, not our judgment on each other. Because I think you're absolutely right. Jesus told us we're not supposed to judge each other so much as we're supposed to work towards understanding how God is going to judge us. And so when James says, for instance, in verse 13, for judgment will be without mercy to anyone who has shown no mercy, he's basically saying, man, if you weren't merciful, if you weren't compassionate, if you weren't helping people, you're not going to be judged well by God in the final days. And that's not a judgment that I have against you or you against me. Rather, it's how God looks at us and views us. God's judgment is not something we like to talk about, right? And yet it is there. God's judgment is there on us, and it's sort of in the final comparison, if you will. So sort of at the end of our days, or at the end of our time, God will reflect on us and go, hey, were you loving and kind? Were you merciful and gracious? Did you do things that were helpful to your neighbor? Or were you just kind of a know-it-all, pristine little something? I don't know. I think God wants us to do something about it, not just think about, philosophize about, or mentally kind of work through.
Yeah, and it makes me, man, it still makes me uncomfortable, even with that explanation, because, okay, let's say that I am taking that in consideration and saying, okay, I'm going to live as though I'm being judged. Then suddenly my motivations have changed. So, like, my motivation isn't necessarily about helping or serving the person. It's about staying out of hell, or whatever it is that you think judgment will result in.
Yeah.
And that I feel like motivations matter. So what's your response to that?
Well, I agree. I think motivations do matter, but I also maintain that it's not literally about heaven and hell. I don't believe that, but rather judgment is about whether or not we were helping to build God's kingdom, whether we were helping to do God's work in the world, because that too is what Jesus was talking about. He was talking about how can you help bring God's kingdom and make it possible, and always the way he described that, Jesus, was by doing good things, right? It was helping the poor, it was feeding the hungry, it was clothing the naked, it was all of those things. And I think James is just talking about that. And so the motivation is not so much about my reward versus my punishment, but rather the motivation is, well, so did I do what God wanted me to do? Did I help do what God was literally telling us in Jesus to do? So for me, that's the motivation. It's not an entrance pass. It's not a reward.
Yeah. Well, and my last question for today is about the very beginning of chapter 2. I think that there are 2 paragraphs dedicated to the sin of favoritism. That's what the title was in my translation. And honestly, I don't remember ever having read those chapters before this series. It's just not something that stuck with me, I guess, over the years. But as I was reading it, and it was talking about like the sin of when you come together as a community, you are more likely to embrace the wealthy, embrace the people who have bathed, the people who are more comfortable to be around. And that's sinful behavior. And when I was reading that, I was like, man, we do that. We do that all the time today. And so I just wanted to get an idea from you. Where do you see the sin of favoritism playing out within the church today compared to how it was happening in the first church?
Yeah. Well, I happen to believe we've gotten a little better. Not lots or not tons, but I mean, just in my lifetime in the life of the church, I've seen us go from, for instance, judging what people wear when they come to church, for instance, or perhaps um, sort of the way they look, if you will, to not taking that so seriously anymore, not rendering people as somehow different or less than because they're not wearing a coat and tie or a nice dress or whatever. And so that part's been helpful. But I think the church, generally speaking, still, because unfortunately it's the human condition, we still look at people and make instant judgments, right? And not so much whether they're right or wrong, but just whether I like you or not, or whether I think you're approvable or not, or whether, and that's sinful. I think that's the point of what James is trying to make, is that when we look at people as less than for whatever reason, whether it's their skin color or whether it's their sexuality or whether it's what they're wearing or whether it's their gender or whatever, when we look at people as less than, that's clearly sinful. I mean, the definition of sin being we've missed the mark, and God's mark for us on that is we're all created in the image of God. And if we're all created in the image of God, then we are clearly sinning when we play favorites one over the other. And golly, I don't want to beat up on the church generally speaking, but we continue to get that wrong on a regular basis. All of us, myself, you, all of us, we sometimes get that wrong, and we clearly get it wrong anytime we look at somebody as less than, even if we don't speak it out loud. We're thinking it in our head or whatever. And I've been guilty of that. I'm ashamed to admit that, but that's part of my life. And so that's where we're messing up.
And when I hear the words sin of favoritism, it's not even because I think like most of us in our minds, we like to think that we don't think of other people as less than.
Yeah.
But there have been times it's not even just less than, it's this someone is different from me. And it's more comfortable for me not to approach them than to try to approach them.
Yep.
Is that me seeing them as less than? I don't know. But even if it isn't, it's favoritism because I'm choosing not to approach that person because I favor a different group of people.
Yeah. Well, so I think I agree wholeheartedly. And isn't it interesting that James, writing somewhere in either the late 40s or early 50s, so literally only a generation after Jesus, the church is already struggling with this, right? Just one generation after Jesus is gone, the church is already having a hard time with that, and he's pointing it out. And I do think, as you've highlighted in the question, because that's in chapter 2 of James, where literally the whole kind of the whole basis of the book of James is about faith with works, and that they have to go together. And that's in chapter 2. We kind of lose sight of that in chapter 2. And so I'm glad that you highlighted it. And, I couldn't give it attention in the message if I wanted to do the other thing. So it's really something we ought to look at from time to time, right? Am I playing favorites? Am I choosing to look at people or value people or honor people in different ways simply based on some form of a demographic? And it's a sin. I mean, that's what he calls it.
All right. Well, that is all the time that we have today. So thank you for joining us. We will be back again on Wednesday for even more questions about James chapter 2. So I hope that you will join us at 12:30 on Wednesday for Go Beyond. And we'll see you soon. And as always, you can catch all previous episodes at tmumc.org/gobeyond.